let's start with describing the testing framework and requirements. Before you can deploy from a sandbox to production, you must meet some testing requirements. Now, notice that in order to deploy from a sandbox to another sandbox, those requirements are not there. These requirements are there only in deploying to production. In Salesforce, when you write Apex, you are forced to have 75% Apex code that must be executed successfully by your test methods. Actually, hold on. Let me back up a bit. For actually going to the testing section here. This usually helps my students understand what we're talking about here. You will be writing test code, or no, actually, you will be writing Apex code because of two particular reasons. You will be writing Apex code because your boss tells you to do so. You will be writing Apex code because Salesforce tells you so. When your boss tells you to write Apex, it is because there is a business use case or user story or some scenario that you need to write the code for, and therefore your boss tells you to write that code. There is another Apex code that you have to write because Apex or because Salesforce tells you to write it. Salesforce forces you to write test code. Don't let anybody else think it is. Don't let anybody else tells you different. But Salesforce is called Salesforce because we force you to write test code. All right, so we are forcing you to write this test code. So then you have basically two pieces of Apex code. One that you write because your boss tells you, and one that you write because Salesforce forces you to write that code. From the code that your boss tells you, 75% of all the lines of your code must be successfully executed by your test methods, which is the code that Salesforce forces you to write. In addition to that, even if you have 90% code coverage, but there are some triggers that do not have at least one line of code executed, you are forced by Salesforce to write test code to at least cover one single line of every single trigger, at least one line of every single trigger. And then every single test method that you write have to be executed without throwing any exceptions or governors limits. So as I said before, in orange here you have the code that your boss tells you to write. That's the business logic. And you have in green. Hold on 1 second, please. I'm sorry. Bless you. All right. Sorry about that. So in orange is the code that your boss tells you to write. In green is the code that Salesforce forces you to write. So when you have those tests, which are kind of looking like the ones on the bottom, we'll talk about them in a minute, and you run them, those tests are going to execute the regular Apex, and it's going to be invoking methods and whatnot from your business logic. And if you need to invoke a trigger, you just need to perform a very basic DML operation, and that will cover that code there. Now, how do you write your methods in Apex, or the code that Salesforce forces you to write? It's to annotate that class with @isTest, annotate each of the methods with @isTest. And then it used to be another legacy old way of doing it, which was to include private test method, static, void, whatever. So, but we prefer now to use the annotation at this test. All right, now your test methods must be static. You don't need an instance of business logic to be able to execute them. They return nothing because the testing engine will not expect a value from that. And they do not get any parameters passed because nobody's expecting the parameters to be passed. Or nobody's expecting to pass you parameters from that. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the data that you're going to be using inside your code. Because one of the most important characteristics of a test is it does not require data in your database. And it can make DML statements, as we saw in a little demo that we did before launch on the triggers. And that is, oh gosh, what's going on today? One of the important characteristics is you cannot, you do not need data. If you do a SQL query, you get 0 records because it assumes that there's no data. And when you do a DML operation and you make changes to and you insert data, as we saw on the test before the on the demo before the trigger, there's no data that is being saved on the database permanently, not committed at least. You can do an insert and you can query and you can get the results, but the data would not be committed at the end of the Apex transaction because it's a test Apex transaction. All right, now, since you do not have any data, you're going to have to create a whole bunch of code to create your records, or in a much, much simpler way, do one simple line of command, which is test.load_data, where you're gonna get the table in which you are inserting the data, for example, account.sObject, or holiday.sObject, or course_c.sObject type, and then the name of the file in the static resources where the data is stored as CSV. One of the difficulties with this is that the data that is on the CSV needs to know about the IDs of the records that will be created when the data is when the test is run, which is obviously not possible. You cannot save the values of the IDs of something that has not been created yet, and that will be created 3 weeks from now. There's no way.
No
but
clue.
You can
maybe
fake
away,
the
maybe
IDs.
They're missing. I really don't know. I
so
know what you're saying, though.
You have your parent object have on the ID field some values, which does not have to be the real 15 or 18 characters ID of a record, just a fake. And then on the child, for the foreign key, you use the same fake IDs. And it will know at runtime that you're talking about those particular records, so it would allow you to create those records. All right, good. As I mentioned before, you do not have access to your data, and you should not have access to your data. And in some very, 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 very rare cases, there is a need to have those records visible from your real database. Then you can have something which is called a see all data goes true. Now, Salesforce, every release, tries to make an effort to reduce the use cases in which you have to use the see all data goes true. For example, it used to be true several years ago that if you were working with products and quotes and product price book and all of these elements, you had to have access to the actual price book. So you actually had to do see all data goes true so you could find that. But it was few years later, it was actually we were actually given a new command that you can use to fake that, so you do not need the see all data equals true. So if you think that you need the see all data equals true, think again and again. And if you definitely do need it, be very careful with it, because this will slow down your tests. If a database has only 3 records, performing a SOCO query is absolutely fast. If the same table has 1,000,000 records, you're trying to find the same 3 records, the performance is going to be obviously a little bit slower, maybe a lot slower. And when you have a gazillion different SOCO queries, like when you run all your tests during deployment, it will take hours rather than minutes or seconds. So make sure that you avoid using the see all data equals true. But even if you do see all data equals true, you are going to be able to perform inserts and deletes and all that stuff, because none of the changes will be committed permanently to the database. All right, so how do you create a test class? So we mentioned before, we're gonna have the classes annotated with the keyword @isTest. Then you're gonna have a class with a name, typically good use case or good rule of thumb is that it's gonna have the same name as your logic, business logic that you're testing, _test. That is when you see the side by side in alphabetical order, it will be easier to find. Then you have the @isTest, where you have a static, void, and no parameters. This is gonna be a test method. There's one more notation, which is @testSetup, which allows you to initialize your test. Eric, I just saw your message. So yes, we'll do that in a couple of seconds. Let me finish this slide, and then we'll go through that. So test setup is an annotation for a method that that sets your data, and once it's run and once it has inserted this particular record, it takes a picture of that, and then it passes that information down, a copy of that information down to each of the other methods. And if the methods delete records and whatever, the next method gets the copy of the original picture. That's what the test setup does for you. So Eric is asking me to have you're very, very nice with these guys. You want them to have lunch, not only feed their brains with knowledge, but also with real food. And now you're asking me to give them a short bio break. So let's take 5 minutes, and then we'll be back in 5. Come on, I said resuming with the slides. There you go. So we just saw before the break how you create a test. So then the question is, okay, so now how do you actually run it? So there are several ways that you run it, and also important is what happens when you run it. So when you run your test, you will see the lines that, in this particular example, the lines on a white background are the lines that are going to be counted for your code coverage. So comments don't count. The header, which is the public class, does not count. Curly brackets, which are kind of meaningless, they do not count. System.debug statements, they do not count. Everything else counts, and you have to have 100% code coverage of those elements. In order to be able to cover line 8 and 10, I need to invoke this method with a list of accounts where one does not have a phone and the other one does have a phone. All right. Now, when you are running a test, and you are the tests are divided conceptually on three different sections or three different pieces. The first piece is where you initialize the data that you want to test. Second one is where you execute your business logic code, the code that your boss tells you to write. And third is where you validate that that business logic code does exactly what you need it to do. Now, if your business logic, the code that your boss tells you to write, is overly complex and it almost exceeds the governor limits, when you add to that same transaction, you add the other elements for the initializing and the validating of your test, it is possible that both added together, you are going to exceed the number of governor limits, which means you would not be able to test it. And if you can't test it, you can't deploy it. So when you use start test and stop test, in between those two statements, you're gonna get an independent governor limit counter. All the limits, you get a new counter for every limit, and every one of them starts in 0. But when you do a stop test, then you resume with a counter that you had before the start test. So basically, at the end of the day, for testing only, you're gonna have 2 sets of governor limits. Once for your test, once for your business logic that is being executed from the test. If you need to run some code as a user, particular user, because you're testing the with sharing attributes of your code, then you can do system run as and run it as a particular user. At the end of every module, we have seen some trails. Here's no different. There's a trail mix. I've seen on the community that Eric is posting the links to those, so make sure you grab them from there. We're gonna do module 8, which is talking about debugging and deployment. This is 10% of the exam and includes things like describing how to monitor and access various types of debug logs, describe the capabilities and security implications of the developer console, workbench, and the Fortacom IDE. Describe the different processes for deploying metadata and business data. Describe how the different environments are used in the development and deployment process. And this is going to be covering 10% of your exam. So we're going to talk about basically 2 things, debugging and deployment. So let's begin with a debug log. For the debug log, see how many people are voting, 142. All right, cool. And still more in APAC. When you go to the developer console, and you go to debug change log levels, you can from here change the amount of information that you get told about each transaction. We can click on add change. We can add a new entry here. Excuse me. Which I usually call it finest. This is the level that will tell me the most of everything. And what I'm gonna do is for each of these categories, I'm gonna select the log level, and it's basically going to be as loud as possible, or tell me as verbose, I guess. Tell me as much as possible for each of them. So under the DB, we have finest, and the callouts, we have finest. The section for Apex code, now you see you have a whole bunch more options, but I always put it on the very bottom. I'm gonna do the same thing for all, no, actually, before I move on. Validation, we have two options, but I make it as loud, as verbose as possible, so I'll always choose the one in the bottom. So I created this entry, I select it, I say done. Now it shows me here the debug level is at finest. And if I run my logs, then I will get a lot more information out of that. And that's basically what we're talking about in this section, where we talk about the different categories, the different log level, and the event type, which is basically the combination of those two things. And that's the screen that we talked about. Deployments. A sandbox is an identical copy of your production environment that allows you to develop and test in a separate environment without risking or compromising data. A sandbox is a replica of your production organization, especially considering the setup, all your objects, fields, validations, workflows, processes, triggers, Apex classes, Lightning components, all the things that you as an administrator / developer build. That is going to be an identical copy on each of your sandbox in the moment or at the instance you actually create them. Because of course, the reason you're creating a sandbox is not as a backup, but because you want to make changes and you want to build those changes in sandbox, and then you want to deploy. So when you start making changes, well, that is not going to be a replica of your production environment anymore. Second, as we will see in just a minute, there are 4 different types of sandboxes. Only one of them copies the entire replica. This is the full copy sandbox, which copies the whole thing, not only the metadata, but also the data and whatnot. All right, so if I go to setup, and look for, I should type a few letters that identify the word. So if I click on sandboxes, I'm gonna create a new sandbox here. Takes me to this screen where I enter a name. I'll name it any name. And then I'm gonna make an identical copy of production, or I can make a copy from dev. And when I'm copying, I have the option of creating 4 different types of sandboxes. We have the developer. Let's see, hopefully I can make this into a little better picture. All right, so I got a developer, developer pro, partial copy, and full copy sandbox. And there are several differences. First difference is the refresh interval. Not how often it will be refreshed, but how long do I have to wait if I want to refresh it. I could have a developer sandbox, and I'm sure that I have one somewhere, where it hasn't been refreshed in a couple months or something. I don't have to refresh it. But if I want to refresh, I have to wait 1 day, or 1 day, or 5 days, or almost a month. The second thing that is different between the different types of sandboxes is the amount of hard drive space that I have. For the developer, I have 200 megabytes. Developer Pro, I got a gigabyte. For partial copy, I got 5 gigabytes. And for a full copy sandbox, because it is an identical copy in data and metadata, then I get exactly the same amount of hard drive that I have on the production environment. Next thing is what gets copied. In the developer, I copy the configuration, Apex metadata, users, profiles, basically everything that an administrator developer can configure. Same thing happens for the Developer Pro. In a partial copy, I can use a template to indicate a sample of the objects that I want to copy. And for the full copy, it copies the whole thing. The other important difference is how many of them can I use. For the developer, I can use 30. For the Pro, I have 1. For the partial copy, I have 1. For the full license, I have already created 1, so I cannot create a second one. Usually, you get a lot of these and very few of these. Now, we have several ways of customizing Salesforce. One of the developer tools, which are the setup menu, the developer console, Forza.com IDE, and Workbench. Now, this slide is a little bit outdated because Forza.com IDE will be retired in October, I think. So which of these tools allows you to create edit classes, create and edit Apex classes on triggers? Not the Workbench. Execute anonymous code? Not in the setup menu. Create Visualforce pages? Not on the Workbench. View logs and code coverage? Only on the setup menu and the developer console. Run your Apex tests? Not in Workbench. Oops, wait, hold on, I'm sorry, where did you go? Go back. Run queries and view the results, not on the setup menu. Modify the schema, not in the developer console, not in Workbench. View the schema in any one of them. Create a sandbox only on the setup menu. Now, with the deployment, not the developer tools, but the deployment tools, we have 3 options. We have change sets. For the COM IDE that has been, that is going to be removed, deprecated, stopped being supported, all that stuff. And the Forza.com migration tool. So which one allows you to change from one org to a related org? Now, what does a related org means? Give me 1 second. This is something that actually is sometimes confusing. So I want to. Give me 1 second. Let me set up something here. Let's see if I can do this. All right, so we have a production environment. For that production, we can create sandbox 1. Or we can create sandbox 2. Just as we saw on the menus earlier when I was showing the 4 difference, or the difference between the 4 different sandbox types in that menu. So you create sandboxes from that production environment. Somebody else has their other production environment, and from there they create a sandbox 3 and a sandbox 4. There are several tools that you can use for deployment with chances. You can deploy from here to here, or in either way, you're up and down. You can either do up and down. In here, you can also do up and down, or you can do sideways. What you are not allowed to do with chainsets is deploy from here to here, or deploy from here to here. You are not allowed to do those types of deployment with chainsets. If you were to use any other API-based tool, deployment, then you can definitely do from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, or from here to here. Not with chainsets. All right, good. So, deploying changes from one org to a related org, and now we understand hopefully what a related means. Any of those tools. To an unrelated chainset, as I show you in that little whiteboard, chainsets cannot do unrelated orgs. Chainsets cannot modify and or delete the data. It cannot do source control. And it cannot deploy changes using an automatic script. Neither can the for the command ID. All of them, and any one of them, will always require you to have 75% code coverage when deploying to production. All right. So deployment considerations. All the files that you're moving from one environment to another are basically XML files. So they are easy to backup. They're just text files. They are somewhat easy to do source control, not through chainsets, but through anything else. Absolutely, you can do that. Most of the metadata includes the version of the Epic's runtime engine that was used to build it. Not everything is able to be deployed, and some things have to be done manually. When you make a deployment, the configurations are not replaced. They are not merged, so they don't override existing metadata. You lose what you had there before, being replaced with a new thing. Things like renaming metadata, sometimes it's kind of crazy, because when you change the name of a field and you deploy the new name, that field is going to be added to the environment rather than changing the name of the field. So you're gonna end up with two fields in there. All right, good. For these, there's a couple of units, couple of trails, debugging and running diagnostics, and application lifetime management. Okay. Couple more things that we have for you include certification preparation resources. So pretty much we finish with the technical material, but you do not leave yet, because there is something that you want to listen to until the end of the session. So don't disconnect just yet. there is a couple of things you need to know. You first of all, you have to have, if you have not taken ever a certification exam from a Salesforce, you need to go to Web Assessor and create a new account. Yeah, if you already have been certified before, then don't worry about that because you already have the account, and you're going to be use that account to take any exam. You can take exams either. You can take exam either in a testing center, or you can go and you can have the exam proctor from your home. That's kind of one of the interesting things that I wanted to do a check when I was asking you where were you guys calling from. Let's see if you guys updated that. Let's do a refresh. 150. So for those of you in LACA or some places where we do not offer these exams, and you have to actually travel to do the testing. And I've been in a few countries in South America where you actually there's no testing center, and you actually will have to fly to Miami to take a test or whatever. That is not really realistic. So for those scenarios, being able to take the test remotely online, it's gonna be a pretty good idea. Now there is some requirements that you can that you have to comply with, and that is on the Web Assessor downloads. There's a list of them. You have to have a camera and whatnot. But hey, getting a camera is far cheaper than having to travel to take an exam. So for those of you who do not have a center near you, you can take it online. If you do have a testing center near you, I highly recommend you actually go there and test it. Take it at the testing center. It's actually going to be a lot more beneficial for you because there's going to be less distractions and whatnot. So make sure that you do that. Whatever you take it, make sure you always bring a little sweater or a jacket with you in case the room gets cold. Sometimes I've heard people taking like earplugs, because sometimes you never know, there's a construction nearby and you cannot concentrate, and you're gonna fail the exam not because you do not have the knowledge, but because you cannot concentrate. So testing center is a lot better. Except if it's too far away, too much of an inconvenience, then you may take the test at home. You do have a coupon coming on, so don't disconnect. You've got a coupon, and I'll give you the coupon in just a bit, but you have 3 months from today's date to take that exam. Thank you so much for coming here. Thank you so much. Drop me a line, please, if you liked the session. Drop me a line also when you pass the certification exam. You can do this in the study cohort, and we'll be very, very happy to hear about your success. We have been, hopefully, Eric has been doing his job and has been answering some of the questions that you guys have been posting on there. Good. All right. Now, last but not least, make sure you take a picture of this code, because this is the only time you will see it. It is the code to get $70 discount on any $200 exam. You can take up to 3 exams, but remember, you have to use these coupons and take the exam for this with these coupons before November 30. And with that, I want to thank you, everybody, for attending, and hopefully I can see you in a future event or future session, or maybe a Dreamforce or something. Please do stop and say bye, say hi. Thank you so much, and good luck.